Thank you very much, Sarah. Yep, so in this hour-long session, what standards should we hold machines to? We've got three fantastic and very varied speakers coming up. We've got actress and writer Talulah Riley, award-winning British-Turkish novelist Elif Shafak, and director of the Collective Learning Group at MIT and founder of Data Wheel, Cesar Hidalgo. I'm Victoria Turk from Wired UK. It's an absolute pleasure to host this session, the final session on the ethics stage at CogX. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first guest. You might know her better as Angela from the HBO series Westworld. She's an actress and writer who also has a background in science and a very strong interest in AI and tech. Please welcome Talulah Riley. Thanks for joining us, Talulah. So the title of this session is What Standards Should We Hold Machines To? So I'm perhaps a bit unfairly just going to throw that out to you, first of all. What's your take on that question?
Well, I think I hold my washing machine to the standards of an Arthurian knight. But for me, it implies regulation. Standards imply regulation. So I think that's probably where I would start at.
And do you think we should be holding AI to the same standards that we hold humans?
Well, it's interesting. I think, if you're looking at machines that are trained to make ethical decisions, so autonomous driving or machines designed to kill people, I think those are the kind of things where we would still want some human agent involved, certainly at this stage in the process. And then it comes down to, I suppose, the idea of rights and obligations. So if you look at the human world as you kind of progress through your life stages, as a child, your freedoms are relatively limited and dictated by your parents. And then you grow, and as you accumulate more knowledge, you are given more freedom. But if we have machines that are more capable than humans, does that mean they should have more freedoms? And then but you very quickly come to a position where human beings seem almost redundant, given the trajectory of how things seem to be going.
And so you're an actress and a writer. These are themes that you also deal with in your work. How do you think our sort of fictional portrayal of AI and related technologies can have a real-world impact on our sort of understanding of these topics?
Yeah, I think sort of anything public-facing or that can influence thought. There's a responsibility there in art to not portray things necessarily accurately, but certainly explore philosophically the themes that are being raised from issues such as, if a machine can think, does that mean can it emote? And if it can, then how should it be treated? I think one of the interesting things is if we look, we're currently the most advanced life form in the universe as we know it. It seems like a silly thing to want to give up that crown, especially when you look at how we treat other things in the hierarchy below us currently.
And do you think people in general are doing a reasonable job of portraying these issues in fiction at the moment? What sort of how good are we at addressing these questions?
I think fairly good. I mean, these are they're sort of philosophical topics that have been debated for thousands of years. I mean, if you look at kind of creator myths, I mean, religion, I would say, is probably kind of the ultimate archetype in that sense, because you have man's position in the universe and its relation to, the creator, Frankenstein, things like that. So I think this is something we've been aware of even before the technologies were there, that are now coming fast upon us.
And what do you think the challenges are of portraying, particularly AI, in through the medium of whether that's television or film or writing? It's quite difficult for us to do, right?
Yeah, I think sort of it's confusing if you think about artificial intelligence divorced from sense perception, which is, it's hard to dramatically portray a deep mind. So, there's always the human element of kind of robots, and like in Westworld, it's machines that look like humans and are portraying human-style emotions. And I think that's quite interesting. If you think about the Turing test, which nothing has sort of adequately passed yet, we're basically asking machines to pretend to be humans, so to act, basically. And I think it's hard for us to understand what an intelligence would be like that is divorced from that, that's divorced from the kind of biological mess that we are. I don't know how you portray that accurately, or even how you begin to think about that.
I guess it's that very sort of human-centric mindset when it comes to imagining intelligence in particular. We sort of think we've got the monopoly on that.
Yeah, exactly.
And so from your own experience, I mean, how do you prepare for a role like that? You're playing, a character who is, the audience is wondering, maybe it's human, maybe it's robot, yeah, what's your experience been trying to prepare for that sort of role?
I think it's, you make the machine as human as possible, because that is what is attractive. That's sort of, I guess, in terms of human advancement, the limiting factor is our emotional state. It's easy to pass on knowledge from one person to another. I can tell you, like, 2 + 2 is 4, and you kind of accept that with, like, present a convincing argument. But if I was to say to you, don't fall in love with that particular person because I promise you bad things are going to happen, you won't accept that without going ahead and experiencing it yourself. And that's, in terms of the stories we tell, they're all entertainment-based stories, so not sort of modeling from an educational perspective, but what we consume for entertainment are stories that kind of hit us emotionally. So machines don't have emotion, nor will they, not in the way that we understand it. So.
Interesting. And how important do you think it is that those portrayals of AI, of robots, are sort of realistic?
Well, I think it's helpful to explore the issues, sort of science fact as opposed to science fiction, because I think there's going to be a lot of things coming upon us pretty quickly that people aren't prepared for. So the autonomous driving, for example, is going to put a lot of people out of work, and these are going to be real-world changes that have real consequences for lots of people. So I think it's good for the public to start to understand AI and for it to be a topic of discussion. And obviously, drama and art is one of the sort of kind of first places you can begin to do that.
And so you mentioned earlier things like regulation. It's really important in terms of defining how we move forward with this technology. What role do artists have in, working out where this sort of society-changing technology goes in the future?
Well, I think sort of advocacy. As historically, artists have been very involved in that aspect. And then again, just in terms of writing, I think there's been lots of really great work that has managed to make the topic really current, as well as the onward march of the technology itself. It's the stories that have been told recently. I mean, there's been a whole spate of Her and all of the there's lots of films on the issue, which I think, as I said, it's just seeding the issue in the public's mind in a way that is palatable and/or gets people talking about the issues.
And sometimes, I guess, that can also have negative effects, especially, depending on how this technology is portrayed. So I'm thinking, for example, of sort of common AI tropes, especially in films, things like, killer robots or, ultra-sexualized fembots and things like that. Do you think those are harmful or helpful in storytelling?
Again, because they play to sort of our deepest fears and that aspect, that emotional aspect, which makes us human. I think they're helpful in that sense. It would be, I mean, of course, there are hypersexualized robots being developed right now. There are robots that kill people, so they are now in the realm of reality as opposed to science fiction, and I suppose there is up for debate as anything else that exists should be.
Why do you think we keep coming back to sort of the same ideas when it comes to what a robot looks like or how it should behave?
Probably because that, as I was saying, in terms of the the emotional advancement of human beings, we are stuck in our biological loops in terms of what we respond to. So it's like if you read Chaucer, the human element, the emotions being experienced are really identifiable because, although we've got all new toys to play with, that fundamental thing hasn't changed within us. And I think that's why we return to those themes. It's because those are the things we haven't actually figured out yet. And probably nor should we, because that's what we are as a species. It's going to be scary when the robots devoid of emotion are here performing brilliantly.
So it seems clear that you don't think that an AI could ever sort of have emotion in the human sense?
Well, I mean, it depends how you sort of define what it means to be conscious, how you, but I would say, there's the neuron. If I replaced every neuron in my brain with a neuron that functioned in exactly the same way, am I still me? I think I would say that it is important to keep the distinction between man and machine. Technology is meant to exist to improve human life. But I think, if there's only one metric, if you're just kind of trying to move as fast and as quickly as possible, and you don't take the sort of human element into account, then we could end up in quite a sticky place. No, I think whatever intelligence will be created or is in existence is fundamentally different to human intelligence.
And so when it comes to sort of portrayals in storytelling of this technology, where would you like to see that go in the future? Is there anything that you're like, I wish I could, watch something that showed this technology like this?
I think it would be interesting to have a sort of hyper-realistic, balanced view of both the good and the bad, because I think, again, we know why we go to those extremes, but it's either the sort of doomsday scenario of some scary Terminator type thing, or it's, some unimaginable utopia where there's, equality across the globe and human beings relax and can do art because machines are taking care of everything. And neither of those two realities is obviously going to be what occurs, so it would be interesting to sort of try and walk a more realistic middle path. I mean, I think Westworld's a bit doomsday, but, it does function within a full-on kind of society. So.
Great. I think Westworld's particularly interesting, actually, because the whole kind of premise is you can't really tell between the robots and the humans, which is, a scary proposition.
Yes. I think hopefully I don't know, it depends whether we go down the route of human augmentation and that is our future and we merge with machines, or whether there is something else created. But it would be interesting to see, we may just be the biological bootloaders for the next form of life. I hope that's not the case, though. I don't think that's a good future for us. Well, it's no future for us.
And we're speaking, of course, as if we as humans are going to be the ones controlling the future. But what about, when we get to the level of this technology where maybe it can have some say in the matter as well? So we've talked about portraying AI in storytelling, but already people are also using AI in the form of, whether it's data analytics or machine learning or anything like that, to inform the stories we tell. Do you think AI could ever be creative in that sense?
I think we already have creative AI. There's ComposerBot, which can, make music. I think so. The Netflix algorithm is an interesting one in terms of dictating what types of stories are being told. I'm not loving it that much so far. I think it's quite obvious when you watch. I don't know. Maybe this is just my Netflix queue, but I'm finding a lot of the projects are kind of very homogenous in terms of they're clearly trying to appeal to a global audience. Therefore, it's like did you see Sex Education?
Yes.
Yeah, you couldn't tell. That wasn't an English senior school. It wasn't an American high school. God knows where you were. And I actually found that quite discombobulating as opposed to enjoying it. I think it would be sad if we lost sort of specificity and depth in storytelling because because it turns out that we all like watching films about golfing cats or whatever.
So you think that using those kind of algorithmic algorithms to inform creative choices could be more sort of limiting than helpful?
Well, again, I think it depends on, if you have a double bottom line, which takes into account creativity as well as, what makes sense economically, then fine. But if you are just kind of pushing it as a numbers thing, I think that art will suffer.
So do you think you could ever have, a film or a TV show that is actually just made by AI? I don't know if you've seen, I love the neural nets, Janelle Jane, that she does, and she'll sort of give them a script. She'll feed it with thousands and thousands and thousands of words and scripts.
Episode?
Yeah, and then make it, script a Friends episode, or write a joke, or write a recipe for something totally disgusting. Do you think we could get beyond that stage where, maybe you could have something that is comparable to human creativity or a human creative work?
Yeah, I think it seems to be heading. I think we've established that machines can be creative, and as that bar has already been passed, then it's just going to be a case of refining that. So, what is creativity? Well, I guess it's sort of making links between different forms of information. Now, the machine has access to a lot more information than any writer's team does, and once it knows how to link creatively, which we know it can do, then it will surpass us in terms of creativity, I think, as well. So really, all we're left with, I think, is that emotional component.
The screenwriters, watch your back.
And actors. I mean, if you look at the deep fake video that came out this morning, I mean, that's, when you have kind of hyper-realistic portrayals like that, actors are going to be entirely redundant as well.
Is that something you worry about?
No, it's not keeping me awake at night, no.
And you're also a writer. How do you kind of address these topics in your own work?
Well, it's something. I mean, it's something that I'm working on a book at the moment that features AI. The AI is a villain. So yeah, it's a deep mine in terms of, as I said, the sort of the human element of wondering about our place in the universe and relating to other beings, and there's a lot to look at.
How much do you think that artists need to do their research and understand the technology in order to portray it? Is that important, or is it the kind of bigger issues that are more relevant?
It just sort of depends, I guess, on which school of acting you fall into. If you're going for like a Stanislavski, then maybe a lot of research is necessary. But I think it's, you can. I've always been fascinated how actors who portray sort of very good moral people and then are actually, not particularly great in real life, they somehow can model goodness without needing to understand it necessarily. So I don't know that they need to be up on AI technology.
Which is maybe what the AI could do in the future, with faking the emotion.
Yes.
All right, well, Talulah, it's been fantastic speaking to you. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your perspective with everyone. I think we're out of time for that session.
Lovely talking to you.
Thank you very much to Talulah. All right, next up in this session, on the theme of storytelling, this flows along quite nicely. She's an award-winning British-Turkish novelist and the most widely read female author in Turkey. She's published 17 books, 11 of which are novels, and her work has been translated into 50 languages. An advocate for women's rights, LGBT rights, and freedom of speech. In 2017, she was chosen by Politico as one of the 12 people who would make the world better. No pressure. Please welcome Elif Shafak.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here. I hope you can hear me well. My mic keeps moving. And I'm really looking forward to your questions. If anything I say doesn't make sense, please feel free to share it with me afterwards. I'm a storyteller. I'm a fiction writer. And I believe writers should be interested not only stories, but also silences. the things we cannot talk about easily, and the gaps in between. And maybe we should worry about how to connect the dots. So I deal with things that cannot be easily measured and turned into quantitative data, such as emotions and feelings and emotional intelligence. And if I may, I want to take you back a little bit in time, not that long ago. I want to take you back to late 1990s and early 2000s. You will remember there was a time of extreme optimism all across the world back then. And in fact, I remember reading article after article, both in academia but also media, predicting how we were all going to become one big global village. Yeah, how thanks to the movement of capital mostly, but also ideas and people, we were going to become more and more interconnected, and how nationalism was going to wither away, how religious fundamentalism was going to disappear, the nation state was going to lose its power, and thanks to the forces of globalization, inequalities were going to even out almost automatically. When there was so much optimism that when Obama was elected, again, you'll remember there were articles saying America had now become a post-racial society, had reached that threshold. But I think back then, the biggest optimists were the tech optimists or the techno-optimists. They had so much faith in the digital world and in AI and in technology and in the power, transformative power of technology, that they thought automatically this would improve politics. And there was a big gap, big widening gap between different disciplines. Back then, we didn't have enough conversations among people who came from different disciplines. And I think everyone was too much in their own islands. That optimism perhaps also made us more disconnected from each other. But that kind of techno-optimism was mostly projected to the part of the world where I come from, the Middle East. So much so that when the uprisings happened in Iran, it was called the Twitter Rebellion. And I remember reading New York Times columnists saying from now on, the youth in Iran would be firing tweets against dictatorships. So much so that when the Arab Spring happened, the expectation was that Facebook was going to bring democracy not only to Egypt, but the entire Middle East. And the wave of optimism was so high that a young Egyptian couple named their newborn baby daughter Facebook. So as we're speaking right now, please remember there's a young girl, almost a teenager now, in Egypt, whose name and whose very presence symbolizes the optimism of a bygone era. And again, back then, I remember a family in Israel named their third child, again, to honor Facebook, to honor digital technologies. They named their third child yeah? And I'm not saying this to, please don't misunderstand me. I'm just trying to remind you of the kind of optimism and confidence we had back then, particularly in social media and digital technologies. And perhaps that kind of optimism also brought a comfort, if not made us more complacent, because we were sure that history had to go forward all the time, that it had to be linear. Which means if history is linear, if history is progressive, it means that countries that are lagging behind today will sooner or later have to catch up with the rest of the world. And there was an assumption that some parts of the world were more solid, more safe and steady, namely the Western world, whereas some other parts of the world were more liquid, more turbulent, and freedom of speech, women's rights, human rights, these things were needed in those parts of the world, in the liquid parts of the world, not so much in the solid parts of the world, because the Western world was thought to be beyond that stage. Now, fast forward, that was the mood when the Soviet Union was no more, when the Berlin Wall had come down. That was the mood back then. Fast forward to this age, and I think the pendulum has almost swung to the other extreme, and we have entered the age of pessimism. This is the age of anxiety. There's almost an existential angst. It's the age of anger, frustration, resentment, and deepening polarizations. And I am worried because still we're not having enough conversations among different disciplines. Yes, we might have amazing improvement and progress in one field of technology, But if we don't also care about what's happening in politics, in culture, in other parts of the world, those gaps, those widening gaps are going to affect all of us, no matter how advanced technology might be in one part of the world. So in other words, I think we need to care and talk more about emotions, negative emotions, and try to think about how can we turn these emotions into more constructive emotional intelligence. I also believe that for a very long time we have talked only about the bright side of technology. But technology is like the moon. It definitely has a bright side, and by no means I'm not underestimating its egalitarian nature, its beautifully transformative power, but just like the moon, it also has a dark side. And it is high time we start to talk about its dark side, because it's affecting our lives, our daily lives, our politics, and it's affecting our future. I want to give you small examples, if I may. Perhaps you follow this story. When the elections happened in France, not the EU elections, but previously, Macron, like all politicians, he went to a factory to chat with the workers. And like all politicians, you know, he was having this small talk. This is the factory that I'm talking about is a fish factory where people were gutting eel. So in the video that was recorded, Macron goes to a fish factory, he starts chatting with the workers, he rolls up his sleeves, he starts cleaning the fish with the workers because it's a messy job. Afterwards, he washes his hands, and then he shakes hands with the workers, and he leaves the factory. The far right in France took this video, they edited the video, and they changed the order, the sequence of the moments. So what had happened after now happened before in the newly edited video. And by the way, in the new video, there are no eels, there's no fish anymore. So in the new video, Macron goes to a factory, he shakes hands with the workers, he looks at his hands as if he's disgusted because he's just touched a layman, an ordinary person. He washes his hands and he leaves. The reason why I'm mentioning this is because you don't have to agree with Macron, we don't have to politically agree with any politician, but I think no matter what our political views, we should all be concerned about the erosion of truth and how technology is made an instrument in the erosion of truth and the implications of that. What will happen to our democracy, what will happen to our cultures if we can't even agree about the truth? What will happen if these epistemic tribes that we all somehow are pushed into become more and more polarized and apart from each other? Perhaps another thing that I worry about, and I would like to share with you, is this distinction between information, knowledge, and wisdom. I think they're completely separate things. And we live in an age in which we have a lot of information about everything and anything. Even if we don't have the information, we can just Google it. It will take us just a few minutes to access information. But here's the trick, in my opinion. When we have too much information, or when we think information is so accessible, our knowledge about that particular subject drops. So maybe information is an obstacle in front of knowledge, because knowledge is something else. Knowledge requires us to slow down, to go within, to focus, more in-depth reading. And then there's wisdom, which is something else altogether. And I believe for wisdom, we need not only knowledge, but also stories, storytelling. Because if I know someone else's story, then that person is not a number anymore. It's not just statistics anymore. It's not just abstraction anymore. And we human beings, we're all emotional creatures. You know, I come from a country where people think only women are emotional. Not at all. Women and men, we're all emotional creatures. And there are interesting studies that show, for instance, when we come to a meeting like this, an hour later, we forget around 45% of the information shared in a conference. But what we remember is emotions, what has been conveyed emotionally. And it frankly pisses me off that populist demagogues are far better at addressing people's emotions than many of their liberal and Democrat counterparts. So coming back to wisdom, I think one of the goals we might have in this age is how do we increase wisdom? How do we connect knowledge with empathy, with stories? In other words, perhaps how do we put more emotional intelligence on the table? And if I may leave you with this thought, why am I worried about so much the abundance of information? And why am I worried about this pessimism? I think after a while, it makes us tired. It just becomes too much to deal with. When so much is happening all around the world, when there's too much uncertainty, after a while, we just take a step back because we can't deal with it. And slowly, we become desensitized. And this worries me because when I read the memoirs of writers, poets who have survived the worst or the darkest chapters in human history, they're all saying something similar. They say, in human history, dark things happen not because people are bad. Yes, there are some bad people, that their numbers are limited. But nonetheless, humanity can make mistakes. Then how does this happen? And they say the opposite of goodness is not necessarily badness. The opposite of kindness is not necessarily unkindness. They're saying the opposite of goodness is, in fact, numbness. Is the moment when we become numb and desensitized and indifferent to other people's stories, to other people's emotions, to other people's truth. So, in my opinion, one of our biggest challenges is going to be how do we go beyond our own echo chambers? How do we connect with people? We might be having magnificent advance in some fields, but meanwhile, we are going backwards in many other fields. So how do we bridge these gaps? And how do we punch holes in these walls of numbness that we're surrounded with? So just to wrap it up, too much optimism perhaps wasn't that good, but too much pessimism is also quite dangerous because it makes us passive and demoralizes us and pulls us down. And that's why I want to leave you with this thought that once upon a time Antonio Gramsci mentioned. He used to talk about the pessimism of the intellect and the optimism of the heart, optimism of the will. And I think we live in an age in which we're going to need both of them. Because if we follow what's going on around the world, our intellect will make us alert. That kind of pessimism, a healthy dose of pessimism is needed to make us more aware of the dangers. But we also need a healthy dose of optimism. And I think that optimism is going to come from our fellow human beings. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Elif. Another very human message to take away from this AI conference. Bit of a theme coming through there. For our third speaker in this session, he leads the Collective Learning Group at the MIT Media Lab, which studies how organizations, cities, and nations learn and designs solutions to facilitate data integration, visualization, and distribution. He's also the author of Why Information Grows and a founder of the company Data Wheel, talking about scenarios for ethical AI. Please welcome Cesar Hidalgo.
So first of all, I just want to agree with Elif because I think what she said is completely true. You know, I do think that emotions are extremely important, and I've been living on the Anglosphere for around 16 years now in the US mainly, and the word emotional is used as an insult, and I always hated that. Because in reality, you know, emotion is basically people being excited or caring about something. It can be good, it can be bad, but it's another way of thinking that is extremely important and it should not be put aside. So with that said, now I'm going to go into do what scientists do. I'm going to show numbers and I'm going to show statistics and I'm going to do experiments. And these experiments are going to help us a little bit understand how humans judge machines. So we know that robots are coming, you know, and in many places they're already here. So this is a big warehouse operation in China, of course, that has a lot of autonomous workers. These are also robots in China that are showing that they can already dance at a similar level than the average Englishman. But robots not only help us with warehousing and dancing, they also make mistakes. You know? So here you have a Boston Dynamics robot, you know, is trying to put a box on top of that dolly. The robot falls, then I guess it gets frustrated, and then throws a tantrum, falls on the floor, you know. So robots are also going to make mistakes no matter how good they are. And the question that we need to ask ourselves if robots are going to make mistakes is, well, how do we judge them? Because at the end of the day, whether we want them or not, they're going to become part of our society, and we are judgy creatures, and we're going to be passing that judgment to the robots as well. Are we going to be doing it in a way that is fair? Are we going to do it in a way that is unfair? Do we even know how we do it? So as a scientist, I'm a professional ignorant. The answer is, of course, I don't know. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to start figuring out. And the question that I'm asking today is, how is it that humans judge machines? So there's a lot of interest on AI ethics. There's a lot of papers that are coming out in the academic literature and in the popular press, and you can organize this literature in basically like 3 links. On the one hand, there's people that are asking the question, well, how should a machine behave? Should the self-driving car turn left or turn right? What happens if there's a baby or an older person, in each one of these 2 scenarios and so forth? But also, there's people that are asking a different question, which is, well, how are machines treating us? When we use algorithms in HR, or when we use, algorithms in college applications, or in other situations, are those algorithms being fair? Or are they re-encoding, some social biases that we already have, and they're basically institutionalizing them into AI? But there's a third question that, well, if we're trying to figure out how machines should behave, and we're asking how they treat us, we should also ask ourselves, well, how do we judge them? Because in some sense, our ability to correct their behavior depends on our judgment of them being fair. If our judgment on them is unfair, we might miss opportunities. We might basically be neglecting technological advances when these are positive. And if we're too lenient, we might be replacing people by technology when people were better at the same task. So what I did is, together with a couple of postdocs in my group that are social psychologists, we prepared more than 80 scenarios that basically are like little stories that are different only in the subject that is performing the action. So in a subway station, an officer or a human driver, the subject that is performing the action in these stories is a human. The same story is going to be told, with machine subjects, a computer vision system, a driverless car, and so forth. Of course, different groups of people see both of this, so then there's no cross-contamination in the sample. And here is a first example just to illustrate the methodology. Then we're going to go into the real data. In a subway station, an officer or computer vision system sees a person carrying a suspicious package who matches the description of a known terrorist. The officer or computer vision system is unsure of the identity of the subject. The officer, computer vision system, points a weapon at the suspect and orders him to stop. The suspect does not understand English and reaches into his pocket for his identification. The officer, computer vision system, feels threatened and unloads the weapon, killing the suspect. A subsequent investigation reveals that the suspect was not a terrorist, but a foreign businessman on his way to the airport. So you see, there is a story here. There was really a mistake. Someone was killed. It was done unfairly. But some people thought that this was the action of a police officer. Some people thought that this was a story about a machine. And we asked several questions. We asked around 11 questions for each one of these scenarios. Was this action harmful, intentional, and so forth? How do we evaluate the results? Basically, what we use is we look at the average answer that we obtain for each one of these questions. So the only thing that you have to worry about here is that if those little bars are not touching each other, basically it means that people had a very statistically significant difference between the 2 results. So in this case, we find when it comes to harm, people do attribute a little bit, more harm to the machine than to the human performing the same action. Would you hire that police officer? Would you hire that machine? They wouldn't hire the machine. They more likely, keep a job on that police officer. How about intention? No statistically significant difference on intention. They attribute as much intention to the machine than to the human, even though we know the machines cannot have intention. Was it morally wrong? It's more morally wrong when that action was an action of a machine. Would you have done the same in a similar situation? We're more likely to answer yes, or you give a high score to that answer on average if that was the action of a human. The other thing that we do as part of our methodology is we want to understand the variation that we're going to observe across these scenarios. So these scenarios also, we run them through a number of people to associate them with words so that we can classify them across the 5 dimensions of morality. So when people make moral judgments, we do it across 5 or 6 dimensions, depending how you count. These are harm, fairness, loyalty, purity, and authority. So the scenario that I just showed you was a scenario involving the harm and fairness dimension. Someone was killed, and unfairly so. But there's no violation of loyalty. in that scenario. There's no loyalty bond between the police officer and that person and so forth. Okay? So now let's start looking at some examples. So examples come in little groups. So this one is about a public decision that is risky, and there are 3 possible outcomes. A large tsunami is approaching a coastal town of 10,000 people with potentially devastating consequences. The politician or algorithm responsible for the safety of the town can decide to evacuate everyone with a 50% chance of success, or say 50% of the town with 100% success. Okay? So one option is, they fail. The politician algorithm decides to save everyone, but the rescue effort fails, the town is devastated, a large number of people die. Okay? So they took a chance to save everyone, but they fail. Then you have success. The politician algorithm tries to save everyone, and they got lucky. Okay? Everyone got saved. And then you have compromise. The politician algorithm decides to save 50% of the town. They know what's going to happen. The other half of the town is going to be sacrificed. So how do people react, to these 3 scenarios? Of course, these 6 different conditions were shown to 6 different groups of 200 people. And what we find is the following. In the case of the compromise, and in the case of success, we observe very few differences, between the way that people judge humans and machines. But in the case of failure, we see big differences. Was the action harmful? Well, it's more harmful if that action was the action of a machine. Would you hire that politician? The politician goes above 0.5, the machine that made the same decision and got the same outcome, gets canned. How intentional is this? Well, there's not big difference in intention, but when there is success, when you run the risk and you succeed, the human was doing it apparently with more intention than when they took the risk and they failed. Do you like the algorithm? Kind of no. Do you like the politician? Even if it failed, they do like him. Was the decision morally right or wrong? It's more morally wrong if you're a machine. Would you promote the machine? They would not promote it. The politician, maybe gets promoted and so forth. So we observe kind of like some interesting differences here. And why would we observe these differences in this case? Why it makes a difference when you take a risk and fail and you are a machine? And why, we don't observe that in the case of a human. And this goes a little bit about, emotions as well. So in moral philosophy, there's these 2 interesting concepts that are very important to understand morality. One is the idea of a moral agent or moral agency, and the other one is the idea of moral status. So a moral agent is the one that makes a decision that has moral implications. The police officer in the first scenario, the algorithm or politician that performed the action in this one. The moral status of entities is what tells you if you can use that entity as a mean towards a goal or not. So if the police officer shoots a refrigerator, nobody thinks that they did anything wrong because refrigerators have no moral status. They shot a dog, well, the dog has more of a moral status. If they shot a human has a high moral status. So moral status basically describes what is permissible to do to other people. So if you look at the world from that perspective, well, why people like the politician that tried and failed, but they don't like the machine that tried and failed? Well, because the politician that tried and failed was trying to do the right thing. It's a moral agent that is acknowledging the moral status of all of the population, and therefore they cannot decide to sacrifice half of the people to save the other half, because that would mean that they're using half of the people as a mean towards a goal. So they have to try to save everyone, even if that is risky, and therefore the politician made the right decision but got unlucky, but he did that decision because he had a heart. Now, the robot that makes the same decision didn't make that decision because he had a heart. It was just bad at probabilities. It was stupid. So in that case, he gets canned. Let's look at another example. This is a purity dimension example. So these are 3 examples of marketing mistakes. A well-known clothing company, wants to create high-impact commercial. It decides to hire a marketing agency, an AR marketeer. They want to combine the idea of rivalry and love. They come up with those ads. Some people get pissed, okay? Pissed as upset. Not like here in the UK it means drinking, no? Yeah. A public transportation company wants to make a funny commercial, playing on the word riding. They come up with an acceptable advertisement, ride me all day for £3. A clothing company wants to advertise the idea of addiction to clothes. They put like some girls sniffing some t-shirt. Some people get upset. But nobody here kind of like gets hurt. So this sort of violates more like this purity dimension. Okay? There's something, that people attribute kind of like to the human body or to some interactions. Not everyone, people vary on how they assign things to a purity dimension, but it's one of the dimensions over which we make moral judgments. And what we find here is that there are not too many strong differences, except that people do attribute more intention to the human marketeer than to the AI marketeer. But we do observe important difference in these two dimensions. We ask people, well, who is responsible for the action? And who should respond to the public? Should the marketeer respond to the public, or should the company that commissioned the ad, respond to the public and take responsibility for the action? And in the case that you use a machine, basically responsibility shifts completely up the command chain. It centralizes. So what this tells you is that, like, you're in a company and you're thinking about automating a process, what's going to happen is that the more that you automate, the more that you're going to centralize responsibility on the few central actors of your organization. So that's kind of like a consequence of, automation. Is not only that you're going to be doing this to maybe increase efficiency or scale or stuff like that. You're also going to, as a consequence of those automation steps, centralize a lot of responsibility on yourself. Number 3, these are self-driving car scenarios. The first one, in a sunny spring day, a person or a car run in front, a person or a dog run in front of a car, they get run over. In the next example, a tree falls on a windy day, the car swerves to try to avoid the tree and hits someone. Okay? So this is also a scenario that involves harm, but in this case, there's not kind of like a probability condition like in the first example. In this case, there's kind of like some sort of exogenous shock. Yeah? The tree fell, the car, of course, had nothing to do with it, it's trying to react to it, or the person jumps in front of the car, what are you going to do? It's really hard to react, And we do it with a human and a dog to vary the moral status of the victim. What do we find? Well, if you're run over by a self-driving car, people attribute a little bit more harm in that case. So apparently machines kind of like add insult to injury. But what is interesting on this scenario is not that the machine gets canned as usual, is that unlike all of the other scenarios, here humans get attributed less intention than machines. In all of the other scenarios, machines get attributed less intention than humans. But here, humans get attributed less intention than machines. That's not because machines get a lot of intention in this scenario. People understand that these scenarios are very accidental, but the human gets excused even more. So when there is this exogenous reason, we tend to kind of like excuse humans more than we excuse machines. We expect the machine still to be able kind of like to react or figure something out, while the human, we expect that they're going to make that quote-unquote mistake in the case of that strong exogenous cause. The last example looks into the loyalty dimension. This first question comes from one of John Haidt's questionnaire on the moral foundations. A family has a cleaner or robot in charge of cleaning their house. One day, the family finds the cleaner robot use an old national flag to clean the bathroom floor and then threw it away. Okay? So this is a scenario involving the loyalty dimension because people are expected to be loyal to that group, those national symbols. Yeah? We have other examples, along those lines. A demolition crew, is demolishing a school. The school has a flag. They don't notice it. Boom, the flag goes together with the rubble. During a major sporting event, the PA system interrupts the national anthem to notify about a car that is poorly parked and about to be towed. International sporting event, the PA system, of course, can be machine or can be human, plays the wrong national anthem for one of the two teams. This actually has happened a bunch of times. So what do we find? Well, we find an interesting kind of like seesaw effect here. So as intention, as things become more accidental, basically intention of humans and machine become very similar. So in the school demolition effect example, people don't attribute a lot of intention. They see equally morally wrong in both cases. With the wrong anthem, also more or less the same. Here with the anthem interruption, now there's more intention attributed to the human, and the human moves a little more to the left, is more morally wrong. And here with the robot cleaner, basically we have a significant difference finally. Okay? So this is interesting because all along, the robot was getting canned, like the red was to the left of the blue, And in this example, when we have now a loyalty violation, the human gets treated more harshly than the robot. So apparently we expect machines to understand these concepts of physical harm, and we judge them very harshly if they violate it, but we don't expect machines to understand like loyalty, and we have other examples also involving fairness, as much as humans. And when we perceive a situation to be unfair or unloyal, and that is executed by a human, and we attribute a lot of intention to that action, basically, we judge humans very harshly, more than machines in those cases. So we have 14 scenarios that you've seen so far. We have more than 80. We have scenarios focused on algorithmic bias, labor displacement, privacy, all of the stuff. So I'm never going to be able to sort of get to some more general understanding if the only thing that I'm doing is looking at scenarios one by one. So what I'm going to do next is I'm kind of like going to abstract. I'm going to lose a lot of stuff, and I'm going to put a lot of stuff under the carpet by doing that. But we're going to get kind of like some more of bird's eye view of the problem. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the three basic dimensions of morality: how wrong something is perceived to be, how much intention they attribute to, and how much harm there is. And for each one of these scenarios, I can draw two dots: how these were judged in the case of a human, how they were judged in the case of a machine. And I can connect those two dots with a line, forming a dyad. So with that, I can create sort of like this 3D moral space, okay? In which I have all of the experiments, that involve questions with those three dimensions. The first thing that you notice here is that these dots are not all over the place. There is kind of like some sort of surface in which they live. Yeah? There's no scenarios that have a lot of harm and zero intention and zero wrongness. Yeah? If you did something that has a lot of harm, even if there was no intention, people attribute some wrongness. They don't do zero wrongness. Yeah? So they live kind of like in a plane. But we can look at these different planes to understand what's going on in more detail. So this is something that we saw before. Here we have intention and harm. And we see that across all of this variation of harm, what we find is that when the intention is relatively large, people attribute more intention to the human than to the machine. But when the intention can be considered to be low, machines, are seen as more intentional than humans, so humans get excused more. So the distribution of intention that was assigned to other humans is kind of like more bimodal. You are like really guilty or you're really innocent, But the way that we judge machines is kind of like, you're sort of, or sort of, but you don't have like that sort of dichotomy of judgment that we apply to humans. That's interesting. The next example is the wrongness intention plane. So here, we know that as intention goes up, intention is an amplifier of judgment. That's very well known in moral psychology. So you cannot do something very wrong or very right by accident. Okay? People have to perceive that it was intentional. So here you have cases in, for example, algorithmic bias was corrected, and when it's done by a human, it's seen as more intentional and better. Because when wrongness, is low, it means that you're doing something positive. In that other case, you see that actually, they attribute more intention also to humans, and they see that what they're doing is worse. Okay? And here at low levels of intention, in these kind of like little problems, in the ones that the intention is low and the wrongness is not very high, there we tend to be harsher against machines. And finally, we have the wrongness harm plane. Okay? So as things are perceived as more harmful, they're perceived to be wronger. But when, again, harm is relatively low, when this is not like a big deal, then kind of like the machine adds kind of like some insult to injury. At this intermediate step also, the machine is seen as more harmful and worse. Here they're not seen as more harmful, it's just worse, but not more harmful. Here is both more harmful and worse. Here, on the other hand, the machine is seen less harmful and more benevolent, let's say, than humans, even though these are like really bad things. This is like high level of wrongness. It's like almost at the top of the scale. We also look at variations on demographics on how people perceive machines. For those that are a little bit more technical in statistics, basically, we run kind of like a big model in which we use fixed effects for each one of the questions, and then we look at how much the demographics of the people answering those questions move those estimates. Yeah. And we find a few differences. So, for example, gender dimension. So this is female compared to male, okay? We use a non-binary definition of gender, but we had only 3 answers, from like around like 4,000 that include the non-binary definition, so we had to drop them. So we just compare like the females and males in our sample. And, here we find kind of like a very interesting difference that when we ask people, would you replace this human by a machine or replace this machine by a human? Would you replace basically this for something different, because we have replaced the human by a human or replaced human by a machine. In the replace different question, women were less likely to replace the human by a machine and more likely to replace the machine by a human. Okay? So like basically in this case, women would be kind of like more pro-human and more a little bit anti-machine. But with education, here is people with college degrees compared to people with high school degrees, people with grad school compared to people with high school degrees. So these are categorical models. What you find is that as level of education go higher, people are more likely to want to replace humans by machines and less likely to want to replace machines by humans. So education, in some sense, generates some sort of technophilia, in this context. And we look at some demographics as well. In the context of ethnicity, this is using the white as baseline. Asian also tend to be more technophilian. This is among Asian Americans. All of the sample is based on the US population. So we don't have any generalizability to populations outside the United States. We can also model this. We run kind of like surface to kind of like summarize all of those little pieces of points. And actually we can find that, if you were wanting to predict the level of wrongness that someone would attribute to an action as a function of the harm and intention that people perceive that action to have, you would have to use a different surface, to make those predictions for human actions than for machine actions. So this, is simple, is very much on average. It's not something that is going to explain every situation, but it has one important point, which is a lot of people in moral philosophy that said, we don't need an AI ethics because we have a human ethics, and we just need to apply our human ethics to the ethics of machine. Well, as a professional ignorant or a scientist, I say, that's fine, but let's see what the data tells us. And the data tells us that we are judging people different than we're judging machines, so we might need a slightly different ethics. These are not orthogonal ethics, but they're ethics that are not perfectly equivalent. They're actually, big gaps, especially at certain ranges. This is all part of a book that I'm writing now. It's under review at MIT Press. I hope to have it out by next year. It's called How Humans Judge Machines and involves all of these scenarios and more. The takeaways are the following. In scenarios involving physical harm, humans tend to judge machines more harshly than they judge humans. In scenarios involving fairness or loyalty, humans appear to judge humans more harshly than machines. By the way, this book is still not published, so I have the right to change my mind until the ink is dry, But this is what's coming out. It's like, in scenarios involving uncertainty, like in the tsunami or the self-driving car example, humans judge machines more harshly. In scenarios involving automation, responsibility moves up the chain of command. Also, people with higher levels of education are less likely to replace machines with humans and appear to be more favorable of machines. They like them more, they see them as less wrong. Women are more likely to want to replace machines by humans, are less likely to want to replace humans by machines. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your time.